As President Biden recently announced, Israel has agreed to a comprehensive deal. Importantly, the proposal says that if negotiations take longer than 6 weeks in phase one, the ceasefire will continue as long as negotiations continue.
Israel will not engage in meaningless and endless negotiations which can be exploited by Hamas as a means to stall for time.
Right, so I had to bring this story to you. You saw, I'm sure you must have seen the proceedings in the United Nations today in the Security Council. So Americans proposed the ceasefire in Gaza, the same ceasefire that Joe Biden had proposed on 31st of May. If you remember, we had done a video here. You can see that video here. Joe Biden has set out the so-called Israeli ceasefire formula. According to him, it was proposed by Israel, and how I had debunked that he was lying. Joe Biden was lying because Israel on the same day had rejected Joe Biden's formula. So it cannot be an Israeli formula when Israel themselves are rejecting that ceasefire. So I had debunked that. Anyway, fast forward on the 10th of June, the matter comes to the Security Council. It was proposed by the same veto lady of America. You saw that veto lady. I have talked about her in details. Now she is proposing a ceasefire. So you can understand, if she is proposing a ceasefire, there got to be something wrong, and you got to doubt the entire thing. Suddenly she can't become a good person, right? After 40,000 people being killed, with more than 70% being children and women. Anyway, so she comes there, she proposes, literally repeats the terms and conditions of what Joe Biden has said on 31st of May, that the entire ceasefire will be in 3 stages. Hamas and Israel will talk to each other. And in the first phase, in the second phase, again, they will continue to talk to each other. There will be exchange of hostages from both sides. Israelis, Palestinian hostages, who Israelis call prisoners, who are locked up in Israeli jails. They will also be released. And there will be a long-term ceasefire. And then the rebuilding of Gaza will begin. Now, that's what this lady says, and everything goes to vote, and the resolution is adopted with 14 members voting in favor. There is absolutely no opposition. Only country that abstains from the vote is Russian. Now, then the mic is given to Russian ambassador. Russian ambassador actually exposes the American design. All Russian ambassador says is that Americans have been repeating and saying that this is Israeli proposal and this is backed by Israel, but we haven't heard from Israel saying that yes, we back this ceasefire proposal. So let's hear from Israeli ambassador, who is sitting here in the same meeting. Let's hear from her. And guess what happens? Israeli ambassador starts speaking and everything unravels. American lady is exposed, completely exposed. An Israeli ambassador, Israeli delegate, exposes America in a way that you have never seen it before. So, contrary to what American ambassador has said, Israeli ambassador says that, listen, we are not going to stop it until we have eliminated Hamas. That's what she says. And then she also says that Hamas should turn in. Hamas should surrender. That's not part of the ceasefire formula that Biden and this lady have been presenting. Do you really realistically expect Hamas to surrender themselves, the people who are fighting for their self-determination and fighting the war of resistance against the occupier? Do you really expect them to surrender? If it was so easy, they would have done it long ago. That's number one. Number two, they are saying that diplomatic efforts have failed. So this Israeli lady is saying that now we should be allowed to explore military option, exactly the same way that we carried out the military operations about a few days ago in central Gaza, killing more than 400 innocent civilians and rescuing 4 Israeli nationals. So that's number two. And number three, she says that there will be no negotiations with Hamas. That's what she says. So I will play the speech by the American lady, and how everything that she is saying will soon turn out to be a lie, and then how she gets exposed by Russian ambassador, and then in the end Israelis, like, they leave no stone unturned in exposing American lie on the floor of United Nations Security Council. I'm not saying this. You watch these 3 videos and see how it unravels.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, the last 8 months have been nothing short of devastating. For Israelis who lost loved ones on October 7th, when Hamas set this conflict into motion by carrying out acts of unthinkable violence. For Israelis and people from more than 16 other countries whose sons and daughters, brothers and sisters are still being held hostage by Hamas. For Israelis who face constant rocket bombardment from Hamas, rockets that are fired off by terrorists hiding in civilian areas within Gaza. The past 8 months have also been devastating for Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Nearly 2 million Palestinians have had to flee from one place to another in search of safety. And for so many, that safety has been elusive. My heart aches for the young child who will forever be traumatized by seeing their family members killed. For all Palestinians who've lost loved ones in this fighting. And for humanitarian workers, people who put their lives on the line to deliver aid to those in dire need, who've been caught in the crosshairs at an unprecedented level. We continue to call on Israel to do everything possible to protect civilians. But let's not forget that Hamas's leaders are the ones who have put civilians at risk by hiding in tunnels underground and facilities that are near civilians and doing nothing to shelter those civilians. I've rarely ever seen anything so egregious and cowardly. Palestinian civilians are living through sheer hell through no fault of their own. And the humanitarian situation in Gaza has gotten worse and worse and worse. Families are living in makeshift conditions, unsure of what the next day holds. Millions are grappling with the uncertainty of what will be left when they are allowed to return home. I think about the parents trying to find food for their families, about the child who's been forced to stop their education, about the elderly person who no longer has access to essential medicines. Colleagues, after 8 months of devastation and pain and trauma, what is needed now more than ever is for the fighting to end in a sustainable way. The United States and every single country in this chamber want to see an immediate ceasefire with the release of hostages. We've heard those calls time and time again since October 7th. Now the opportunity is here. We must seize it, and we must speak with one voice. For months, the United States has worked around the clock alongside Egypt and Qatar to broker a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. Because we know this is the best way, actually the only way, to bring about a durable end to this war. Since the brief ceasefire and hostage release last November, such a deal has proven elusive. Why? Because Hamas has refused to accept any agreement. But right now, there is another opportunity, because as President Biden recently announced, Israel has agreed to a comprehensive deal. That is the deal now on the table, which is nearly identical to Hamas's own proposals. This deal would bring hostages home, ensure Israel's security, enable a surge of humanitarian relief, and essential services, including water and electricity, medical facilities, and rubble removal to Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and set the stage for a political settlement that provides a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. This deal has been endorsed by countries across the region, including Algeria, Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the UAE, as well as by the G7 and those 16 countries whose citizens are being held by Hamas. Now we're all waiting. We're waiting on Hamas to agree to the ceasefire deal it claims to want. But we cannot afford to wait and wait and wait. With every passing day, needless suffering continues. And so all of us, as members of this council, have a critical role to play. We can help bring about peace by adopting the resolution before us, which calls on Hamas to take the ceasefire deal and urges both parties to fully implement the deal's terms without delay and without conditions. This resolution, put forward by the United States after consultations with all council members, makes clear that the world wants an immediate ceasefire with the release of hostages. The resolution also explains the framework of the deal. So let me take a moment to lay that out. The first phase of this agreement would last for 6 weeks and include an immediate, full, and complete ceasefire with the release of hostages, including women, the elderly, and the wounded, the return of the remains of some hostages who have been killed, the exchange of Palestinian prisoners, the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the populated areas in Gaza, the return of Palestinian civilians to their homes and neighborhoods in all areas of Gaza, including in the north, and the safe and effective distribution of humanitarian assistance in Gaza, including housing units delivered by the international community. Importantly, the proposal says that if negotiations take longer than 6 weeks in phase one, the ceasefire will continue as long as negotiations continue. And the United States, Egypt, and Qatar would work to ensure negotiations keep going in good faith until all the agreements are reached and phase two begins. In the second phase, upon agreement of the parties, there would be a permanent end to hostilities in exchange for the release of all other hostages still in Gaza and a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. Phase three would see the start of a major multi-year reconstruction plan for Gaza and the return of the remains of Israelis and others still in Gaza to their families. Colleagues, this is the deal on the table. Israel accepted this deal because it ensures its security. As President Biden made clear, Hamas is no longer capable of carrying out another October 7th, and the United States' commitment to Israel's self-defense is ironclad. Colleagues, I'll also note that this resolution rejects any demographic or territorial changes in Gaza, including any actions that reduce the territory of Gaza, and it reiterates this Council's unwavering commitment to the vision of a negotiated two-state solution, where Israelis and Palestinians live side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders, consistent with international law and relevant UN resolutions. We all agreed that a negotiated outcome along these lines is the only way forward. The draft before us also stresses the importance of unifying the West Bank and Gaza under the leadership of a reformed and revitalize Palestinian Authority. And this text recalls resolutions this Council has adopted since October 7th, including Resolution 2712, 2720, and 2728, all of which demanded that all parties to the conflict protect civilians. Colleagues, we need Hamas to agree to the ceasefire deal. And then we need Israel and Hamas to implement the deal without delays or conditions. I don't want to keep waking up to news reports of more fighting and more loss of life. I don't want the families of hostages, many of whom I know personally, to endure even one more day without their loved ones. I don't want another Palestinian family, including the relatives of people I have met with, to experience any more loss or suffering. I want to see an enduring ceasefire where Israel is safe from the threat of further terrorist attacks and rocket fire, and Palestinians can begin rebuilding their lives in safety and security. I want to see families reunited. I want to see Palestinian children safe and fed and back in school. I want to see people return to their homes. We all want to see this better future. Those of us here in this room, people across the world, and most of all, those living under this terrible conflict. And so, colleagues, we must seize the opportunity before us. We must speak out with one voice in support of peace. I urge all Council members to vote yes on this resolution, to vote yes for peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/448 please raise their hand. Those against? Abstentions? The results of the voting is as follows. 14 votes in favor, 0 votes against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 2735. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you again, Mr. President. Colleagues, today this Council sent a clear message to Hamas. Accept the ceasefire deal on the table. Israel has already agreed to this deal, and the fighting could stop today if Hamas would do the same. I repeat, the fighting could stop today. This Council and countries across the region and the world have endorsed this agreement. Hamas can now see that the international community is united behind a deal that will save lives and help Palestinian civilians in Gaza start to rebuild and heal. United behind a deal that will reunite hostages with their families after 8 months in captivity. United behind a deal that would lead to a more secure Israel and unlock the possibility of more progress, including calm along Israel's northern border with Lebanon. We cannot forget the Israelis displaced from their homes in northern Israel under threat from Hezbollah. These attacks from terrorist groups backed by Iran must stop. They have to stop. Colleagues, the ceasefire deal would pave the way toward an enduring cessation of hostilities and a better future for all. As President Biden acknowledged just the other day, the Palestinian people have endured sheer hell in this war, started by Hamas. There's an opportunity to chart a different course. Hamas must take it. Egypt and Qatar have assured the United States that they are continuing to work to ensure that Hamas engages constructively, and the United States will help ensure that Israel lives up to its obligations as well, assuming Hamas accepts the deal. Over the past 8 months, this council has often faced divisions, and the world has taken notice with understandable frustration. But there's another side to this story, because today we adopted the 4th resolution on this conflict. For the 4th time, we have spoken out and made clear the only way to end this cycle of violence and build a durable peace is through a political settlement, one that ensures Israel no longer lives in the shadow of a terrorist group and is further integrated with the region. And I want to make clear that Israel will always have the right to defend itself against threats to its security and to bring those responsible for October 7th to justice. Colleagues, today we also reaffirmed our commitment to the vision of 2 states where Israelis and Palestinians live side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders, consistent with international law and relevant UN resolutions, and where a revitalized and reformed Palestinian Authority leads a unified West Bank and Gaza. This is the future that we must help bring about. And this all starts with the ceasefire deal that this council endorsed today, and that this council unequivocally called on Hamas to accept. Colleagues, today we voted for peace.
President, the Russian Federation abstained on the draft Security Council resolution prepared by American Council colleagues in support of the proposal of mediators on a ceasefire in Gaza. From the very outset of the military escalation in the Palestinian-Israel conflict, we have consistently and unwaveringly advocated for the imperative for a permanent ceasefire regime, including in order to release hostages and remedy the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. We have always welcomed any diplomatic efforts on the ground that are focused on reconciliation within parameters that suit both sides. At the same time, we have a whole host of questions about the American draft resolution, whereby this Council welcomes some deal, the ultimate outlines of which are not known to anyone, perhaps except the mediators. The information circulating in various open sources are very contradictory. The sponsors of the resolution did not keep the Security Council in the loop of the details of the agreement. We essentially proposed to a cat in a bag. As such, there was no negotiation process. As such, the sponsors brought a variation of a prepared text de facto calling on members of the Security Council against the clock to sign up to it. Hamas is called upon to accept this so-called deal. But still, there is no clarity regarding official agreement from Israel, as is written in the resolution for the deal proposed by President Biden, given the many statements from Israel on the extension of the war until Hamas is completely defeated. So on what specifically has Israel agreed to? Perhaps we'll hear a response to that question today from the Israeli representative. We are convinced that the Security Council should not sign up to agreements with vague parameters and without guarantees not only of their implementation on the ground, but without the slightest clear understanding how the parties themselves, what their attitude is towards it. Essentially, the Council is giving a carte blanche and signing up to this plan with details that they don't have. The 3 parameters and phases, that's not details. From the very beginning of the escalation in Gaza, the Council has adopted 3 resolutions which have remained on paper in terms of implementation. Here we can add a 4th. This is not something we could call a positive trend. The adoption by the Council of a new document with the contents of which raises a mass of questions, even without a clear demand to parties for the immediate and permanent ceasefire, undermines its authority as the main body for maintenance of international peace and security. We did not wish to block the resolution simply because it, as much as we understand, is supported by the Arab world. However, all of the questions that we have remain and require a response. Thank you very much.
I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Council, from the very first days following Hamas's invasion and brutal massacre on October 7th, Israel's goals have been very clear: to bring all our hostages back home and to dismantle Hamas's capabilities. Israel is committed to these goals: to free all the hostages, to destroy Hamas's military and governing capabilities, and to ensure that Gaza does not pose a threat to Israel in the future. And as we have echoed numerous times in this very chamber, once these goals are met, the war will end. If Hamas were to release the hostages and turn themselves in, not one more shot needs to be fired. Yet sadly, for the past 8 months, Hamas has refused. 120 hostages are still being held by Hamas in appalling conditions. To this day, Hamas continues firing rockets at Israeli towns and cities and advancing their goal of murdering every Israeli. Members of the Council, it is Hamas that is preventing this war from ending. Hamas and Hamas alone. It is the genocidal jihadists who started this war and who choose to prolong it. Pressure must be applied upon Hamas, and blame must be placed where it belongs, on Hamas terrorists. This Council has adopted 3 resolutions calling for the release of hostages, and each time Hamas has utterly ignored your request. Hamas does not care what the Council has to say, because they have never been held responsible for their crimes by the Council. The pressure on the terrorists should have begun long ago, but it's still not too late. It must begin now. Colleagues, Hamas's refusal to release the hostages through diplomacy has proven that the effort to bring our hostages home must also include military means. And this Saturday was the perfect example of how this can be achieved. As a result of a heroic operation, the IDF rescued 4 hostages from Gaza. These hostages, Noah Argamani, Almog Meir Jan, Andrei Kuzlov, and Shlomi Ziv, were being held in residential buildings by Palestinian families. While the hostages were guarded by terrorists, Gazan civilians were their jailers. These so-called innocent civilians were not only cooperating with the terrorists, but were complicit in their heinous crimes. As the world witnessed on Saturday, it is Israeli soldiers who sacrificed their lives to bring our hostages back home, while Hamas intentionally sacrifices Gazan children to prevent us from rescuing hostages. Israel regrets any harm to civilians, but it must be emphasized that Palestinians who cooperate with Hamas and take part in their war crimes are not uninvolved. This is the reality we face. The loss of life in Gaza is a tragedy, but if you don't put the blame on Hamas, you're advancing their strategy. Colleagues, Israel stands firm on our principles, and they have not changed. We will continue until all of the hostages are returned and until Hamas military and governing capabilities are dismantled. These have been our goals from day one. Just as President Biden stated on May 31st, Hamas must not stay in power. Israel will not let Hamas rearm or regroup so that Gaza can pose a threat to Israel. This is the unwavering goal that we are determined to achieve. This also means that Israel will not engage in meaningless and endless negotiations which can be exploited by Hamas as a means to stall for time. Mr. President, Hamas is solely responsible for this war. They invaded Israel, massacring innocents and taking hundreds hostages. They continue to hold our loved ones in Gaza and continue targeting Israel. They use Gazans as human shields while furthering their genocidal goals. The time has come for this Council to finally hold Hamas accountable, to finally place the blame where it belongs, to finally condemn terror. As the Security Council, it is your duty to apply relentless pressure on Hamas terrorists and ensure that all the hostages return home. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much for watching this video. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.